this is the history of Fort Armstrong. Okay, at that time, we had a famous black man that came through here that was Dred Scott. Okay, he was here approximately 1847. This is what his decision as far as whether he was free or whether he was still a slave precipitated the Civil War. Okay, that happened right here. He was a slave, or if you want to be politically correct, a valet for Dr. Emerson, who was the surgeon at Fort Armstrong. Okay, during the Civil War, this was known as Rock Island Prison Barracks. It was not known as Rock Island Arsenal. It was known as the Andersonville of the North. Whether it was really that bad or not, you'd had to be a prisoner to say, okay? It wasn't that bad probably for the soldiers, okay? The 108 U.S. colored troops that were sent here were mustered up out of Kentucky and out of Tennessee. There were 980 black Union soldiers that came to Davenport, Iowa in 1863 to be the guards over the Confederate prisoners of war. At one time, there were 8,000 during the Civil War. That amount of people jumped up to 12,000, okay? A very good friend of mine's son, Ben McAdams, his son has since passed away in the last few years. He wrote a book on rebels. The name of the book was Rebels on the Arsenal, or on the island, I think it was. And this discusses what went on, the commanding officers and that were there during this period, because they were only there, the black soldiers were only there for about 8 months, and then they left here and went to Vicksburg, Mississippi, okay? But when they came in, they came up the river on steamers. All of them were in their military blue. They were carrying a musket, which this is the size caliber, if any of you didn't know what size ammunition they used during the Civil War. They used between 50 and 58 caliber ammunition. That's why you see a lot of soldiers during the Civil War, the old movies and that, they only had one leg or one arm, because if you get hit with a piece of lead this big, it normally took off whatever it hit, or they amputated. Yes?
That's not to say the mini ball?
No, that's, the mini balls were balls, yeah, but these were rifle. But the mini balls were as big, the understanding I have also, they were as big or maybe even bigger. Any other questions? Okay.
Excuse me, did they recruit the 8,000 to 12,000 blacks in Kentucky and Tennessee?
Okay, the 8,000 to 12,000 were Confederate prisoners of war. The 980 that they recruited, they took them off plantations. These were ex-slaves. Very few of them were free men, okay? They went to the plantations, and some of them they actually had to buy, depending upon the size, that had 2 or more slaves on them. So you go from 2 to, like, the Rockefellers plantations were like 5,000, okay, slaves on them. Huge pieces of land. And most of us know that the Civil War was not fought about color. It was fought about economics, about money. If you today, like I just retired from John Deere. I worked at John Deere for 42 years. If John Deere could get people to work for them for free, look how big a company John Deere would be today, even bigger than it is. So it was basically slavery is working people without paying them. Okay? So that's what that was about. But the soldiers, there were 980, there were no leaders of any soldiers, north or south, that were black. All of them were white officers that were over the colored troops. Okay? Now you have to imagine the period of time. Were there automobiles in 1861 when the Civil War started? What was the mode of transportation in America in 1861? Some horses. What else? Number 1. What'd you say?
Your
Feet. Walking. That's why the slaves could not escape. Okay? You see these pictures, a slave with something over his back and that. look at his feet. They had no shoes. You can't go very far if you're barefooted, okay? So in turn, this was part of it too. This is how you keep people, you know, down. You worked out in those fields, and most of the time they talk about cotton fields. Well, cotton wasn't the number one thing, but that's what people, the news media used, because you've got the white cotton, you've got the black slaves. But there was sugar cane, there was tobacco, any product that was produced out in the fields, the slaves were the ones that did the work, okay? So, like right now, we're sitting here right now, if a space shuttle landed over there on that parking lot, and you had aliens, we'll call them, get off of it, what would happen in this room? We'd be horrified, wouldn't we? Everybody'd be running, trying to get away. That was similar to what happened when these 980 slaves landed in Devonport. There were people on horseback, as he was saying, that got on their horses and started riding and went to Eldridge and all these little outlying towns on that side of the river and said that the blacks have invaded Devonport. They're all in uniform. They're carrying two weapons, a musket and a sidearm, okay? And they're marching. They're in, you know, they're soldiers. They've been trained or whatever. But you see something you've never seen before, this scares you. And that's what it did. It scared the people of Devonport because the military had not notified anyone except the commanding officer there that they were coming. So it wasn't in the newspaper that, you know, next week this is going to be happening. So all of a sudden you've got almost 1,000 black soldiers, and they did what they were supposed to do. They got off and they marched to the prison barracks, and they settled in, but it scared people because at that time, this is 1863, there were less than 50 black people even living in this whole area on both sides of the river. Something like 3 to 4 black men, and the rest were black women. What do you think their occupations were?
Laundress, cook.
Prostitutes. This was the wild, wild west. The majority of the prostitutes were black women, Indians, Native Americans, and very few white people. White women had come this far west at that time. Downtown Devonport was nothing but taverns and brothels, both sides of the street. That's what it was. Because we're talking about a period of time where you had to be rough and tough to make it this far. This was the wilderness, okay? So in turn, this is what we've got. Maybe a few bicycles as far as transportation, but most people walked around. They used mules. John Deere had just invented the self-cleaning plow in 1837. So things were really what we would say today backwards, but it wasn't for the people that was living at that particular time. This is what they were used to, okay? So all of a sudden, you've got all of these black soldiers that are here, okay? How did they get paid? They got paid half as much as the white soldiers. So, and they were Union soldiers, but equality didn't come around for another 100 years, okay? So that was a part of it. Their soldiers, well, we got to pay them because we're fighting this war because of slavery. But instead of getting $30 a month, they got $15 a month. Well, by military, Army regulations, you have to give a man liberty, what they call liberty, after he's worked so long. So you give him his money and he has time off from work. Okay, that time off from work, he can leave and come to Rock Island, Moline, Devonport or whatever, and that's what they did, okay? What do you think happened when they mixed in with the locals? Now, the majority of the locals were Europeans, mainly Germans, okay? If you check the houses over in Devonport, some of those houses still have breweries in them. They're on River Drive. They love to drink, okay? Well, soldiers love to drink too when they get off. Well, they had problems. All of a sudden, you've got all these black men that are in these taverns and brothels, and everybody's carrying a gun. If they're not carrying one gun, they're carrying two. So what happens? Men are
are drinking, women are around, marijuana, all that was going on too. They had shootouts, mainly over the women. These men that had been here for years before felt these women belonged to them. Now they're paying them, but they still felt, this is my Sally or my Susie. I don't want somebody else sleeping with them. Well, if you've got 25 cents or 50 cents, you're next. None of the soldiers, and there were shootings and killings and this, that, and other, none of the soldiers were ever court-martialed and found guilty for shooting anybody during the 8 months they were here. But, they were arrested, and commanding officer came, got them out of jail or whatever, and then, the military has prisons over everybody. You got a gun, I got a gun. Back then, it was whoever drew first and whoever shot first. But during that period of time, by the time they were here 6 months, and they had so many problems, the commander over them said, that's it. Nobody gets to go to town. We got too many problems. Every time somebody goes to town, there's, havoc. Well, how do you think that affected the local businesses here? They wasn't happy at all. This is who they're making their money off of. So they go to the commanding officer and basically beg him, let these soldiers, off the base. And he said, no, just too many problems. We will keep them right here. So up until they left, they were restricted to stay at Rock Island Arsenal. Now, if you can imagine, this room and this barracks was surrounded by a fence. It was like a stockade, and approximately, we'll say, as high as this right here, there was a catwalk all the way around, where these soldiers, the sentries they called them, would walk to each other, turn around, and then walk back to the next guy down here. Approximately 10 feet from the fence, the stockade wall, was what they called a dead zone. This dead zone was basically a garbage trench, because they didn't have, running water and garbage cans and all that. So this is where stuff was basically thrown in, and then it went to the river. They had water that met with it and flowed. Well, from there to the wall was considered the dead zone. If you came within that zone, you were to be shot. And everybody knew it, Guys played ball out there, pitching, catching that. If the ball went past there, they had to get permission from whoever, the sergeant or whatever, for someone either to go get that ball or for one of the soldiers. But everybody cannot be incarcerated. There were guys that were literally, intentionally walked up to that zone intentionally, and you've got like 4 guns, muskets pointed at you. They get blown away. There wasn't no stay back, stop, this, that, and other. Everybody there, all those 8,000 soldiers knew that if you come up here, what's going to happen to you? So there were incidences where guys just got tired of it, did not want to be there, and did that. In the book that, I think his name was Benton McAdams, Mr. Ben McAdams, who served out at Arrowhead Ranch, his son wrote, there were letters that he had copied in that, of these southern men that had wrote back home to their families and that. And that was another thing. If you had a soldier over there, a husband, a son, or whatever, you basically had to move up here to give them blankets, clothes, food, or whatever. It's not like prisoners of war that we think of today. The families, and that's why the Quad City area has every culture, every religion, every race here. These people migrated here to take care of their sons and their husbands and that, and would bring food over for them during the day to help feed them. Because when the war got bad, when they cut the rations, who gets the rations cut first? The prisoners. They cut the rations in half, so they wasn't eating normal. But if your wife or daughter was here, they could bring you food over there, and you got to eat. So this is the way of life every day at Rock Island Prison Barracks. And the barracks, these buildings that were built, you can see daylight in them. In the wintertime, and they had rough winters back then. There were men actually freezing to death. You had one big stove, like a potbelly stove, that sit in the middle of these barracks, and there were rows of barracks. If you let that fire go out, chances are somebody's gonna freeze to death. So it was your job to keep your fire going in your particular barracks. And then there were diseases. People caught disease. Over there now, there's 1,964 Confederate graves, okay? We're talking about the Civil War. The Confederate soldiers were buried at a different location than the National Cemetery. But to make it even deeper, where do you think the black soldiers, where do you think if they died while they were here, where were they put? As far away from the white soldiers in the National Cemetery as possible. If you go across the bridge, okay, to Moline, National Cemetery is on your right-hand side. Just before you get to the guard shack, there's a little gravel road there that you can turn to the right. And if you turn to the right and go up that little gravel road, there's a big cannon over there that's turned upside down. That's a sign in the military of distress, okay? Right around that cannon, and this was the furthest place on the island, is where there are 48 black soldiers that were buried. Over the years, the rest of the cemetery has emerged and came over there. But when, in 1863, when they died, they were buried as far away as possible. Because we gotta realize, people are still prejudiced. Just because you're fighting for the same ideas don't mean that you would believe in the same thing when it comes to dying. Do you want to be buried beside a black person, a black soldier, where, you know, you're all fighting a war? Now, with Iraq and Pakistan and that, you go to the National Cemetery, you get buried the next spot that's available there. No ifs and buts about it. But we're talking about the Civil War. So it was still discrimination. These black soldiers were buried over there. So if you ever get a chance and you're ever in any cemetery, old cemetery, on these headstones, it will say right on there what you are. It will say U.S. COL Troop. That stands for U.S. Colored Troop. They distinguished that even in death. They wanted to make sure that everybody knew that you were something other than white. Now, they never put on there that you were Czechoslovakian or you were Protestant or you were anything else in the National Cemetery. But with the colored troops, they made sure everybody knew that's what these men were. Okay? So they're here for approximately 8 months. They're being, they get in trouble. You know, they're drinking, they're protected, and that the book that Mr. McAdams wrote, one of the stories in there, this guy had been a plantation owner, Tennessee, Kentucky. Okay? He wrote that only a few months ago, these slaves belonged to us and had to do everything we told them to do or else. And now we basically belong to them. And they tell us what to do. And he stated in there that there were people, prisoners, that were there that had paid some of these soldiers, some of these guards, to let them escape. Okay? Give them money because you still have currency, you still have money. Well, what did they do? They took their money, and when they got ready to escape, they killed them. They shot them anyway. And I guess this was brought up to the commanding officer in that, and like he said, these are prisoners. If they made some kind of deal like that, he needed to hear it from who made the deal. They're dead. Did they do these things? Probably. Because we're dealing with people, first of all, these soldiers, none of them knew how to read or write. Okay? Prior to the Civil War, there were no lynchings and KKK. All of that came after the Civil War. The only people that got lynched in America prior to the Civil War were white people. No black people got lynched. You were worth money. You were worth, some of them were worth as much as $1,000. thousands of dollars for people. And then after a while, it was cheaper to breed them. We were bred right here in America like you breed cattle, horses, dogs. You breed them, it don't cost you anything but to feed them. But if you pay for them, are you going to go out here and lynch up $1,000? But the white people that tried to help, some of the rules were, if you got caught teaching a black person how to read or how to write, that's what you got. No ifs and buts about it. You didn't get a trial. Your trial was you got caught. After the Civil War is when Nathan Bedford Forrest started the KKK, and then you had your, as they call it, 100 years of lynching in America, and those were black people. But there were literally hundreds of white people that were murdered because they were trying to teach somebody to read and write. The first thing when the slaves were brought over here, they were told, you do not speak your language anymore. You have to learn the King's English. Okay? So if you were Swahili or Pygmy or whatever, you could no longer speak that language. That was cut out. You would get beat if you tried to continue to speak your language. So there's a lot of stuff in the history books, and I belong to some organizations that's trying to get it right. Okay? Because they could not read or write. Who wrote the history books? The white people of the day that were authors and that, and some of them were famous in that. How did they write it? They wrote it slanted. If you look at just some little simple things, the music, the songs, the darkies were happy and gay. How can you be happy and gay when you're getting beat? You're getting raped? You're getting forced to work? And I don't know how many of you have been down south, but it gets daylight down south about 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning. When it was light enough, you went to work and you worked until it was so dark you couldn't. And usually, this was like 9:30 at night. And this was your regular regimen. Wasn't no 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, 40 hours. It didn't work like that. And after a while, you knew who was the best workers. You wanted a particular size, a particular person that could do more work. You didn't want Zulu warriors like Shaq that plays basketball and these football players. You had to feed them more, and most of them wouldn't work. Whether you want to call it lazy or whatever, they just wouldn't work. So you needed someone that was approximately 120, 130 pounds, men and women smaller or whatever, that could withstand the heat also, because down south it's hot. So after a while, they figured out exactly which races from Africa, because there were tribes and different races in Africa that they wanted to bring over to America to do this work. So in turn, that's what they brought, that's what they got, and that's what they reproduced. And these plantations, after a while, there were people that they would sell off, whether they were troublemakers or whatever. They were not allowed to, shall I say, have sex, because in most instances, it wasn't love, okay? If the plantation manager, owner, or whatever came out and told you to sleep with her and sleep with her until she's pregnant, that's what you did. And that's what you reproduced, because they knew after a while, it's like, we're talking about big business, money. This is what you do to get this product. So in turn, that's where these men came from plantations in Tennessee and Kentucky, with the idea that if you fight for this Civil War and win, you're going to be free men. So they were happy to join. In some instances, and the military would go in and deal with these plantation owners as far as, okay, you've got 120 men working here between the age of this and that we would like. Well, the Civil War isn't over, okay? As far as they're concerned, it's still legal. How did they get these people? They either bred them or bought them. So they had to pay for them in some cases. So they would come to a deal, okay, we'll give you so much money per head for these men. That way they weren't getting robbed. Because when they first went in, they just came in and like just took them. Well, that didn't go over too big. Because if you're going through Tennessee and Kentucky, you've got to feed your troops, right? Who's raising the food down there? The plantations are raising the food. And after a while, they start burning this stuff up. You gonna come and rob me and take all my slaves? I'll burn all my crops up. You won't get nothing to eat from here. So you know it was bartering or whatever, I guess you would call it. Whereas they would leave enough people there with the women to raise the crops. So when the next batch of soldiers came through there, you know, they got food and then water. They poisoned the wells and that. But if you dealt with them halfway decent and properly, they would help you out. But you know, you're under siege. These are people that's got guns. Well, after these men had been here for this long, and this is the first time they had freedom, they decided after the Civil War, as I was saying, they left here, went to Vicksburg, and then after Vicksburg, the Civil War was over. Well, they knew what was left on those plantations they came from. They had been in Illinois, and they had been in Iowa for 8 months. They went back home, and they told their neighbors and their friends and their families, there's a place called Moline. There's a place called Rock Island. I live there. Pack up everything and let's go. And it's sad to say, the majority of the black families that live here today, that come from those roots, have no idea how they ended up in the Quad Cities. Because everybody's never did, you know, their family history, their roots or whatever. But that's where they came from. They went back, loaded up, and they moved up here. Okay? You've got jobs here where you get paid money. You had John Deere with factories here on the river. You had International Harvester, Farmall. Plus you had all the little smaller ones. And the arsenal. You know, the arsenals basically then came into existence where they started manufacturing weapons over there. The frontier is still wide open. So the soldiers, and a lot of the black soldiers stayed in the military and moved west. All of them didn't just, you know, muster out. Some of them went with the 7th and 9th Cavalry and, you know, fought, you know, where Custer got killed and all that. So some of them made careers out of the military. But the older black families that are here in the Quad City area that have been here, that's where they came from. They came from these 980 black soldiers and their friends that ended up coming back to the Quad City area, the majority of them because of economics in that. And they had been in Devonport, stayed in Devonport. That's why now the population over in Devonport, the minority population, is larger over there than it is over here. Because to them, that was all they knew. Some of them probably never even came to Rock Island. There wasn't really a lot to come to. Whereas you could walk off of that arsenal and you're right downtown Devonport. But then after a while, people just started, you know, wherever you got a job, you're still walking. Mode of transportation is still feet. So if you've got a good job somewhere, you know, now we have transportation, people run across bridges every day. But if you got a good job in Rock Island, you move your family over to Rock Island, close to your job. But the 108 U.S. colored troops, as I say, there's 48 buried over there. And I have a list of their names and that. And I helped some families here locally, you know, trace that back to who their relatives were and how they got here. And, you know, it's fascinating. Basically, it's putting a puzzle together backwards, and you don't really know what that puzzle is going to look like until you got all of those pieces together. Where do you get this information? Because you got to remember, black people up until after the Civil War were not even, you know, counted really in the census. They were counted with the horses, with the pigs, with the animals. Okay? So how do you find out this information? You have to go to the older black churches, if they're still in existence. You have to go to the black undertakers. And a point of information information here locally. Up until like the 80s, the white funeral homes here in the Quad City area did not handle black bodies. That's wild, okay? But then, all of a sudden, these people that have started working for John Deere, for Farmall, for Case, they start dying. You get the same insurance policy, you get the same money to bury them as you do a white person. Now, they've almost put the black funeral homes out of business because you get your money directly from John Deere. You don't wait for the family to bring you that check. You fill out the papers, and they send that money directly to those funeral homes. But at one time, you had black funeral homes, because we're talking about discrimination, and you have white ones. And in turn, the black undertakers in any city that you went to back then were usually the wealthiest people in town. They got all the money, because usually there was only one. One in Davenport, one in Rock Island, none in East Moline. So in turn, this is how they accumulated their fortunes. And in some cities today, down south, well, not cities, I'll say towns, because cities are larger, you still have that same thing going on down south, where the black funeral homes get all the black bodies. Still America. At the arsenal, in the museum there, the majority of it. Some of it I've got from people that lived here, the nursing homes, like Oak Glen Home. There are people out there that are just more than happy to talk to anyone, okay? I go there, I talk to them, I film what they say, they tell you the way it was, and some of these stories that they tell you, you know, living in 2007, it's almost unbelievable, but they're not lying. They had no reason, you know, to lie. But the military records and that, they are all there on the arsenal. Now, you might have to dig and dig and dig to find exactly what you want. But that's one thing about the military. They keep precise records. They can tell you almost anything. You know, in some instances, you might have to request it, and it might take a while, and then they might get it for you. And, you know, some of these books are this thick, and then they tell you can come over on a certain day and you can go through it yourself. And then the Latter-day Saints, the Mormon Church, okay, they are on, I think it's Wisconsin Avenue. They, back years ago, decided they wanted to be the repository for the census, okay? If you want to do your family roots, you go over there and they have all this on microfilm, microfiche, and it's all located in Salt Lake City. You tell them what information you want, and they will have those records sent to Davenport, and then normally they're there for like a week to 10 days. You can go over there, you can view them, you can make copies of them or whatever, you know, to find out the information that you want also. Say somebody told you someone in your family, you know, was in the Army or Navy or whatever, you can get those records, and if you know that they were in Davenport during, say, 1870, I think they started taking the census actually in 1870 and keeping records. You can go and view that, and beside their name, it will say what their occupation was. If it says they in Rock Island and the west end of Rock Island. I hear gunfire almost every day or night in the west end of Rock Island. That war is being fought because of economics also. Drugs. When you put people out and they have no jobs, they get kicked out of school or quit school, and you have to go back to your history. Why were black people bred to work? When I came to John Deere in 1965, I had graduated from AIT. The only place I could get a job at John Deere was in the foundry. Every black man went to the foundry. You could not go anywhere else. Now, people are still reproducing. If you don't get an education in America, and you're a young black man or female anymore because they're committing crimes too, there's only two places for you in America: the cemetery and the penitentiary. And not necessarily in that order. But there is no gray matter out there. That's where you are going. Simple as that. No education, you have to do something illegal. Have to. Unless you're wealthy. And if you're wealthy, you're going to get a store-bought education. Your parents are going to make sure you have the best education. But if you are poor and you are black and you are in America, you are going to the penitentiary or the cemetery. That's why we have private cemeteries today. A prime example we have here today is East Moline Correctional Center. How many people know what that was prior to it becoming a correctional center? Right. Did you hear what she said? It was a mental health institute. Our good Governor Thompson, when he was the governor, decided, why should the state continue to use taxpayer money to take care of these people that were handicapped? He closed all of the places down. Elgin State Hospital, East Moline, Harrisburg, Peoria, and what did they do with them? They turned them into prisons. East Moline was set up for 300 mental patients. The first thing they did, they put double beds in there. It became 600 convicts, felons. Okay, all of a sudden, they're running out of space. They put another tier of beds in there. It went up to 900. Last month, and I get these reports on the county board, last month, and they put another tier in there. East Moline Correctional Center population is 1,102 convicts. What's going on in America? What's going on in our backyard? Where did the majority of these people come from? Chicago, because it's the biggest populated area in the state of Illinois. There's over 10 million people in Cook County. They send them to East Moline. Rockford, second largest. Peoria, East St. Louis. What happens? The same history when these prisoners of war were brought here, their families came here to take care of them, right? The same thing's happening in East Moline. These families are moving here to be close to their loved ones or whatever. We have got a whole culture here of kids that have not got educated. You come here at 10 years old, you've been living in East St. Louis, Chicago, or whatever. Your mother goes, puts everybody on welfare. These young boys, their minds are working. It's about money. They tell their mother, don't register me out here in East Moline at Glenview Junior High, because I ain't going to school. So from 10 years old till now, 22 years later, these boys did not get an education at school. They got their education on education dollars and that. A piece that came up 2 years ago that they wanted to sell in Cincinnati at auction, and they had it listed as a slave necklace. Do you know what a slave, does anyone know what a slave necklace is? Your prized slaves, the ones that you fought against each other or whatever, they wore necklaces. What they call necklaces is basically a collar like you find today, a dog collar, okay? It was made out of chain and it was made out of leather. Some of them had their names inscribed on them, and they had a eyelet there for putting okay? Well, one person said that this was a dog collar. Another person, the owner, said it was a slave collar. As a dog collar from the 1800s, it would have been worth maybe $50 or $100. As a slave collar, it was worth $5,000, okay? Well, the people had to get the provenance to prove what it was, and I was involved in it. And they asked me, okay, what do you say it is? I checked it, and one way you can check is the size, okay? If it's, most of these dogs that they had back then weren't big dogs that had, you know, like a 22-inch neck. This was a little fluffy, a French poodle or something like that. And they had rhinestones and all these fancy things on them, you know, for the family pet. But the big ones that, you know, you could put a leash on, these were made for men. Men that fought to the death. And that's what that particular one was. And the main way you can check is the diameter. What kind of dogs are there in America that have, well, they have some now, because the other part of it is, these dogs that are fighting are getting injected with steroids and that. So, yeah, these dogs are big as people almost. But that's what that was. It came off a certain plantation, and I think it was Louisiana, and it was proven that's what it was worth. So it sold at auction, and that's the kind of money it brought. I think you have questions.
I have a number of questions. The soldiers going down.
They had any, you know, confrontation as far as fight. And you got to realize soldiers usually want to fight. That's what you join the military for. You want to fight. So they were more than happy to fight. They weren't successful mainly because, and duly so, they were afraid to give these people that they've been mistreated for all these years, give them weapons. So that's why they took them in as soldiers, as far as doing the cooking, as far as doing basically, you know, that type labor, but they did not want to give them weapons.
That they would in turn manumit them, they would give them for freedom. That's what they enticed them to get them.
Well, they told them that if the South won, yeah, but when you say manumit, during this time there were manumission papers, okay? What a manumission paper stated was who you were bought from, that you were a free person, you had to carry these papers on you all the time, and that's what happened to Dred Scott. When they left here, him and Dr. Emerson, and went to Fort Snelling, he fell in love. Now this was free territory supposedly, right? Wisconsin, Iowa, Illinois, but they came from Missouri, which was slave territory. When he got there, he fell in love with this lady. Dr. Emerson bought her from another military man, and they had 2 daughters. Okay, when Dr. Emerson passed away, his wife gave Dred Scott his wife, I think her name was Liza, and their 2 daughters, their manumission papers. These papers stated that they were free people, okay? Were dated, you know, like the courthouse was stamped, all that. Well, what's a person do when they get their papers? They go back home. Wrong thing to do. St. Louis, Missouri is where they were from. They go back to St. Louis, Missouri, and they've got these papers. The first thing they got was arrested. Missouri was slave territory. And we're talking about people that were adamant. I mean, to the extent on the House of Congress, one of the slave state congressmen actually became another congressman from Ohio, and the rest of them sat up there and laughed about it. And he beat this man almost to death. Because these people were hardcore. You know, if you believed in slavery, you believed in it all the way. Because this is where your money's coming from. So the situation was, they went to court, and the courthouse, if any of you ever get opportunity, the courthouse is still in St. Louis, Missouri. They have preserved it, and they've got all that evidence in the court case, and they show a movie in that about the Dred Scott decision. They go to court. The court rules that they are free people. politicians. You know, this isn't utopia. This is people that, you know, your cousin is so-and-so and your brother is so-and-so. It don't matter what the law says. You're going to rule a certain way. So they ruled that they were slaves, that they still were slaves in Missouri. So then it went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and Roger Taney was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And we're talking about politicians, slick politicians. We got some slick ones in D.C. now, but they could learn a whole lot from some of these people back then. And a lot of people think that that Supreme Court ruled one way or the other. They didn't. They ruled that they have no rights, because Dred Scott, his wife and daughter, took it to the Supreme Court. They said that they have no right to even bring this to the Supreme Court, that the only people that can bring a case to the Supreme Court are citizens of the United States. And they compared it to bringing a horse or a cow, bringing a case to the U.S. Supreme Court. They can't do it. These people are not citizens of the United States. They can't do it. Well, that precipitated the Civil War. You know, they're saying, look at them. They're human beings. They were born and raised right here in America. They have their papers that say they're free. Well, just because you have your papers saying you're free does not mean you are a citizen of the United States. And we've got some things coming up in the next few years. All of this is going to be tested again. Arnold Schwarzenegger, the governor of California. You think this man doesn't want to be the president of the United States? Under our rules and regulations, he cannot. Because he was born in Germany or Switzerland, Austria, is that where he was born? So, you know, we've got more stuff coming up the road and always will have. But that was the situation within under the sun, okay? With that system when it broke down, okay? Most of you heard about the Sally Hemings situation and the black sand that they were related in that with Jefferson, okay? There were black people whose fathers were the slave owners or their sons or whatever. If you check America today, the Fortune 500 companies, you find very few dark complected blacks that are heads of these companies. What happened when the slavery situation broke down? These white men knew these kids were theirs, okay? They're mulattoes or whatever, but they're there. They knew that the South was not going to change. They gave these children money and sent them out of the South. Does anybody know what passing means? What's passing mean?
Passing for what?
Passing for something, well, not necessarily white, something other than black. Passing. This, when I was growing up, I was born in 1946. This was something that was prominent in the black community. If you were light enough, you could leave where you were at and go into a city and become a white person, a Greek, Jewish, Italian, something other than black, because you had more opportunity, okay? So this is what these people done. And they made it in America. They made it in corporate America. That's why they come out with these Fortune 500 companies and that. You will very seldom see someone as dark as me. Because the darkies that were in the fields, that were as dark as me, did not get that boost. Because this is capitalistic society. It's about money. If you've got money, you can do things. If you don't have money, you cannot. So in turn, they got that boost up here, okay? And there's a movie, I think the name of it is Imitation of Life or something, that is made about that. It was made in maybe the 50s or 60s, about this black girl that was, you know, light complected, that did not want to be black. But her mammy, and that's what her mother was considered in the movie, kept telling her, but that's what you are, that's what you are. But you have to compare the two. was Choctaw Indian and Czechoslovakian. And her famous saying was, there was a black man. But that's what she was. Can I pass for Czechoslovakian? No. But I know my heritage by doing my roots. I know where I came from. And when they had that Bosnian War, I had relatives that was right back in our homeland because that's our homeland too. But we cannot relate to it the way we relate to our black side of the family because we're dark, we're prominent. Half of my brothers and sisters come out like my grandmother and that, light complected, good hair. The rest of us come out like me. But, you know, this is America. And America is black and white. Now, it is changing a lot, but nobody in this room is going to ever live to see it where it's just people, one race, under God. That ain't going to happen. Maybe in 100, 200 years, but no time in the near future. But I hope I answered your question as far as that, but that's kind of what the plantation era was about. At the end of the Civil War, okay, once people had to be paid for their labor, the number one job in America for black people was cooks. Now we're talking about down south, we're not talking about, you know, Chicago up here. Everybody ate, and prior to what people think, all these slave owners, whatever, was wiped out, that they knew what was coming. They went and hid their gold and silver. If you check the families down south today that are wealthy, they call it the old money versus the new money. They're the same people, okay? They hid their resources. Everyone loved to eat, okay? Miss Sally, the mammy on my plantation, is one of the best cooks, okay? They always had these great parties. They still have them. If you go down south, you got southern relatives, they find out you're coming to town, they have these big food parties. So they still continued that tradition after the Civil War. So you have a party over at this plantation, Miss Sally's the cook. You come to the party, you own a plantation, you go back in the kitchen, you tell her how great, you know, her food is, and you ask her, well, how much is Mayberry paying you? And she says, oh, $5 a week or whatever. You tell her, and you know, room and board, because you got all these slave shanties, you know, so you get room and board. Well, you come over to my place in the next couple of days and talk to me. So she goes over to your place, and you tell her you'll give her $10 a week. She packs up her stuff, and she's over at your place. In a year's time, she might have hit 4 or 5 different plantations, and this was the backbone of the southern blacks. People that had been working all their lives out in the field, some of them couldn't even get a job because they had the wrong attitude. They wouldn't hire them. Now you got to pay them. But these women, they taught their children, most of them girls, they taught them how to cook too. So they tell them, okay, I'm leaving your plantation, but my daughter, if you want to hire her, you can hire her. She's a good cook, she's young, but she's been watching me for the last 15 years. So she gets